At 3:17 a.m., Venezuela went dark, and then the headline hit. In an instant, power grids failed, screens flickered, and the night sky swallowed whole neighborhoods as alarms screamed through Caracas. Radar blips stacked and vanished. Emergency broadcasts cut in and out, speaking in half sentences and static, while phones across the hemisphere vibrated with alerts no one was ready to read. This wasn't a rumor warming up. This was impact. This was the sound of a country holding its breath as the world leaned closer. Then came the statement. One sentence, posted, clipped, and shared faster than the explosions themselves. Donald Trump said U.S. forces had struck. He said the operation was decisive. And then he dropped the line that detonated across every border, language, and timeline. Nicolás Maduro and his wife had been captured and flown out of Venezuela. Not cornered, not negotiating, removed. For immigrants watching from Miami, Madrid, Bogota, and Queens, the moment landed differently. This wasn't abstract geopolitics. This was memory and trauma. Family WhatsApp threads lighting up, parents calling children, children translating headlines for parents. For years, Venezuelans abroad had been told to be patient, to wait, to trust slow diplomacy while their homeland fractured. Tonight, patience collapsed. Something irreversible had cracked open. Newsrooms froze. Anchors stalled. Commentators scrambled for confirmation that refused to arrive on schedule. Supporters cheered. Critics warned. Skeptics demanded proof. But the claim itself had already done its work. It rearranged reality before anyone could catch up. If this was true, nothing in the Western Hemisphere would ever be the same. Power, exile, and accountability had just been rewritten in real time. Across social feeds, immigrant creators spoke in one breath, mixing grief with cautious hope, reminding viewers that borders don't erase belonging. Progressive activists urged restraint and humanity, warning that celebration without truth can wound the innocent. Elders remembered coups and interventions, while younger voices demanded transparency, law, and dignity for civilians. The tension wasn't just left versus right. It was fear versus fatigue, survival versus spectacle. In living rooms and dorms, people asked the same question quietly. Who is protected when power moves this fast? History whispered warnings, and empathy demanded care for families, migrants, and futures caught between empires colliding. And yet, shock is never the full story. Headlines don't fall from the sky. They're built, choice by choice, silence by silence, until the moment they finally explode. Because to understand how we got here, you need to rewind to the moment Washington decided diplomacy was dead. The shock of the claim didn't matter because it was loud. It mattered because of where it landed. Venezuela is not just another country on a map. It is oil beneath the soil, sanctions wrapped around everyday life, and migration stretching across continents. It is a test case the world has been staring at for years, arguing about policy while people pack suitcases with whatever could still be carried. When something this extreme happens there, it doesn't stay there. It ripples outward, touching markets, borders, and identities far beyond Caracas. For decades, the international approach followed a familiar script. Condemnations, emergency summits, sanctions designed to squeeze elites while promising to spare civilians, even as grocery shelves emptied and families fractured. It was slow pressure, measured language, and plausible deniability. But what Trump claimed shattered that rhythm. This wasn't another sanction package or diplomatic rebuke. This was kinetic action, the language of force replacing the language of process. And that shift alone is why the world froze. Because once a superpower crosses from economic warfare into physical intervention, every rule starts to wobble. If leaders can be captured and removed, what does sovereignty mean? If borders can be violated in the name of justice or stability, who decides where that line is drawn? International law, already strained, suddenly feels fragile. Allies wonder if precedent protects them or endangers them. Adversaries ask whether this is deterrence or a provocation. Smaller nations watch closely, knowing they're never just spectators. Trump sits at the center of that disruption, not as a quiet manager of norms, but as someone who treats norms as obstacles. His political identity has always thrived on rupture, on proving that what was once unthinkable can be done if you move fast enough and dare critics to keep up. Supporters call it strength. Detractors call it recklessness. Either way, it changes the calculus. It tells the world that patience is optional and that shock itself can be strategy. Analysts struggled to keep their voices steady. This feels like 2003, one whispered on a late-night panel, but faster, and with social media already deciding the verdict. A Venezuelan student in exile texted a friend, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. A mother in Texas asked whether this meant she could finally go home, or whether home would be something unrecognizable. Even seasoned diplomats admitted privately that the ground had shifted under their feet. Markets reacted before governments did. Oil prices twitched, currencies flinched, and shipping routes recalculated risk in real time. In Latin America, leaders faced crowds demanding answers they didn't have, while activists insisted that human rights could not be an afterthought of strategy. Progressive voices warned that liberation narratives have often been used to justify suffering, urging vigilance for civilians and migrants who always pay first. Others argued that endless restraint had only prolonged pain and empowered abusers. What makes this moment dangerous and historic isn't just the claim of capture. It's the invitation it extends to every power watching. If this stands, it becomes a template. If it fails, it becomes a warning. Either way, the old middle ground erodes. Neutrality feels thinner. Silence feels complicit. And for immigrant communities who know what happens when global powers play chess with human lives, the stakes are personal, immediate, and aching. History watches moments like this without blinking, recording who acted, who hesitated, and who paid the price later, while ordinary people carry consequences long after leaders move on, leaving migrants, workers, and families to navigate the aftermath alone, in uncertainty, fear, resilience, memory, and hope worldwide today, still waiting. This is why the night matters. Not because of explosions alone, but because of the questions they force into the open, questions no press conference can neatly answer. And at the center of this storm stands a man who ruled Venezuela with an iron fist for over a decade. The story of Nicolás Maduro does not begin with tanks or sanctions. It begins in the long shadow of Hugo Chavez. When Chavez died, he left behind not just a presidency, but a mythology, and Maduro stepped into it as a caretaker who promised continuity. He spoke the language of revolution, wrapped himself in legacy, and told a wounded nation that nothing essential would change. But power, once inherited, demands proof. And Maduro learned quickly that loyalty must be enforced when belief starts to fade. Over time, authority hardened into control. Courts were reshaped, legislatures sidelined, and elections transformed into rituals where outcomes felt decided before ballots were cast. International observers raised alarms about manipulation and intimidation, while state media insisted on triumph and unity. To supporters, Maduro was defending sovereignty against foreign interference. To critics, he was consolidating power by hollowing out democracy itself, one institution at a time, until dissent sounded like treason. Corruption allegations followed relentlessly. Billions vanished as oil wealth bled away, enriching insiders while inflation devoured salaries. Reports surfaced of luxury apartments, guarded convoys, and imported delicacies existing alongside empty pharmacies and endless bread lines. The contrast was impossible to miss. Televised speeches promised resilience and dignity, while hospitals rationed electricity and parents skipped meals so children could eat. It was governance performed on a stage, disconnected from the ground beneath it. Maduro's posture toward the outside world grew openly defiant. Sanctions became proof of conspiracy. Criticism became imperial aggression. He dismissed Western leaders as hypocrites, framing himself as a bulwark against domination. That rhetoric resonated with some, especially those scarred by historical intervention. But insulation breeds isolation. As diplomats walked away and embassies thinned, Maduro's circle narrowed, and loyalty became a currency more valuable than competence. Repression crept in quietly, then openly. Protests were met with force. Opposition figures were detained, disqualified, or driven into exile. Each crackdown was justified as necessary, temporary, unavoidable. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. Fear replaced persuasion. Surveillance replaced dialogue. The state grew louder as trust dissolved. For many Venezuelans, especially the young, the choice became stark: silence, submission, or departure. Still, strongmen rarely appear worried until cracks widen. And cracks did appear. Soldiers defected. Whistleblowers spoke. Turnout thinned, even at choreographed rallies. Social media pierced censorship, carrying images of suffering beyond borders Maduro claimed to defend. The revolution aged, and its language felt increasingly hollow against lived reality. Even allies began hedging, calculating distance rather than devotion. What made Maduro dangerous was not cartoon villainy, but endurance. He survived sanctions, scandals, and predictions of collapse. He learned to wait out outrage and weaponize fatigue. Each year he remained in power reinforced the idea that nothing could remove him. That belief settled heavily on a population exhausted by scarcity and displacement, and on an international community unsure how far to push. But power built on pressure is brittle. When authority relies on fear and isolation, it loses flexibility. Decisions become slower. Information becomes filtered. Leaders start hearing what reassures rather than what warns. History is unforgiving to rulers who confuse survival with invincibility. And somewhere beneath the speeches and ceremonies, the ground was shifting. Inside the palace, distance from reality widened. Advisors filtered bad news, reports softened language, and statistics were massaged into optimism. Commanders pledged loyalty on camera, yet whispers traveled through barracks and kitchens alike. Currency controls failed, black markets thrived, and the promise of socialism curdled into survival economics. Migration became the loudest vote, millions leaving not in protest but necessity, carrying passports, accents, and stories of state that could no longer provide certainty. Maduro responded with spectacle. Grand parades, televised addresses, and ritual denunciations of enemies replaced solutions. He leaned harder on symbolism, believing volume could substitute legitimacy. But symbolism decays when daily life contradicts it. Every blackout, every empty shelf, every funeral chipped away at the narrative of control. The state still commanded weapons, yet it was losing meaning, and meaning is the currency of endurance. Internationally, patience thinned. Even governments once sympathetic questioned sustainability. Quiet back channels explored exits while public statements stayed frozen. Sanctions tightened, relief stalled, and humanitarian corridors became bargaining chips. The regime's armor thickened, but its vision narrowed. Power turned inward, suspicious of shadows, addicted to survival. In that isolation, mistakes compound. Intelligence misreads threats, allies overpromise, and timing slips. When pressure finally arrives, it feels sudden only because warnings were ignored. The machinery of control still hums, but it is brittle, unable to bend. History shows that collapse rarely announces itself. It accelerates quietly until one night rewrites everything. By then, even absolute power struggles to react, because momentum has shifted and the ruler discovers too late that permanence was an illusion, shattered by time, people, memory, and forces no decree can silence forever alone. Because every long-standing ruler eventually meets the moment they never prepared for. Donald Trump enters this story not as a whisper, but as a rupture. His worldview is simple, abrasive, and deliberate. Strength teeters, hesitation invites chaos, and spectacle forces attention where diplomacy stalls. To supporters, this reads as courage. To critics, as danger. But even his adversaries admit one truth. Trump does not drift. He moves. He rejects the language of patience and replaces it with action that shocks systems awake. In moments of crisis, he treats unpredictability as leverage, believing confusion destabilizes opponents faster than negotiation ever could. It is governance as pressure, identity as defiance, and power as performance. Always loud, intentional, and designed to dominate attention globally now. He carried this approach onto the world stage long before Venezuela. From summit tables to televised standoffs, Trump challenged leaders publicly, dismissed protocol, and weaponized unpredictability as theater. Allies were unsettled, rivals provoked, diplomats exhausted. He praised strength, mocked restraint, and treated international norms as flexible suggestions rather than sacred rules. Each confrontation built a precedent. North Korea, Iran, trade wars, sudden withdrawals, sudden threats. The pattern was consistent even when outcomes were not. Trump forced every actor to react to him, on his timing, under his framing. In his calculus, control begins when others lose narrative balance. This approach rewarded dominance over dialogue, decisiveness over deliberation, and constant disruption. In this framing, Venezuela was never just Venezuela. It was a symbol, a challenge, a test of whether American power still intimidated or merely negotiated. Trump viewed prolonged sanctions as static pressure, slow and reversible, while kinetic action communicated finality. He believed that decisive force, used sparingly but unmistakably, could collapse stalemates others accepted as permanent. Critics warned of escalation. Supporters argued that endless restraint only emboldened authoritarianism. Trump positioned himself above that debate, insisting results mattered more than consensus. Strength, in his view, was moral clarity expressed through action, not permission. It rejected gradualism, patience, and diplomatic choreography, favoring shock, leverage, and irreversible momentum forward. Now, always, globally, watching. Inside Washington, that philosophy translated into compressed decision cycles and narrow rooms where hesitation felt like failure. Advisors debated legality, fallout, and alliances, while Trump pressed for outcomes that could not be ignored. He demanded options that ended stories, not extended them. Diplomatic cables piled up, warnings echoed, and yet his instinct remained fixed. Act before momentum dies. To immigrant communities scarred by slow international indifference, this speed felt intoxicating and terrifying at once. The promise of change collided with the fear of collateral damage, forcing progressives to hold hope and caution simultaneously in a single, irreversible, historic, dangerous, defining, global moment unfolding now, tonight, everywhere, watching, breathless, uncertain, together. Trump's calm and public masked intensity behind closed doors. He absorbed pressure, deflected criticism, and framed hesitation as weakness dressed in procedure. Unmoved by allies urging restraint, he returned to a single question: would action reassert dominance or invite decay? In his rhetoric, America did not ask permission. It acted, then demanded adjustment. That posture thrilled those tired of apology politics and alarmed those who believed legitimacy required coalition. Either way, it recentered American agency in a world grown accustomed to U.S. caution, daring others to respond or retreat without delay, loudly, publicly, decisively, unapologetically, reshaping expectations, risks, and futures worldwide. Tonight again, watching history turn sharply fast now here. For progressives, this moment created an uneasy paradox. The target was an authoritarian regime accused of crushing dissent, yet the method echoed interventions that once harmed the vulnerable. Trump exploited that tension, presenting himself as the only figure willing to confront tyrants while dismissing moral anxiety as weakness. His confidence forced a reckoning. Could justice arrive through force, and who pays the price when it does? The doctrine of disruption demanded faith in outcomes over process, asking audiences to judge success by results rather than restraint, even when consequences ripple outward, unpredictably, across borders, families, futures, identities, memories, wounds, histories, repeating again, painfully, loudly, unresolved, tonight, watching, together, uncertain, still. Behind the scenes, deliberation narrowed toward action. Intelligence briefings emphasized windows closing, opportunities fleeting, risks compounding. Trump listened, interrupted, and circled back to speed. Delay, he believed, empowered enemies and demoralized allies. When consensus failed to form, he treated that failure as justification, not warning. The choice became binary: move now or surrender narrative control. In that compressed logic, Venezuela transformed from crisis to stage, from policy challenge to defining test of will, one that demanded an answer loud enough to dominate history and attention. Meaning, memory, power, legitimacy, fear, hope, spectacle, consequence, endlessly, globally across screens, streets, borders, timelines, tonight, now again fast, decisive, final, looming, heavy, charged, imminent. That answer arrived not as debate but decision. In a presidency defined by escalation, this was its sharpest edge, yet a move designed to end ambiguity through force. Supporters braced for vindication. Critics braced for fallout. Immigrants watched with hearts split between justice and fear. The machinery turned, the plan locked, and diplomacy fell silent. Whatever came next would not be reversible, only survivable. The world did not yet know the outcome, only the intent behind it and the speed with which it moved. Every institution sensed the shift, knowing consequences would echo across generations and borders worldwide. Tonight, immediately. Then, the order was given, and the world held its breath. The night air over Venezuela was thick with tension before a single engine screamed. Jets roared across the darkened sky, tracing invisible lines of force, while drones cut precise arcs above critical installations. Every hum, every pulse of radar, every sudden light in the distance was a note in a symphony of disruption. Communications flickered as cyber warfare quietly disabled defenses. Radar signals warped and vanished, leaving commanders grasping at ghosts on their screens. For civilians in Caracas, it began as a low rumble beneath the city's streets, growing to an unrelenting roar that rattled windows, hearts, and nerves alike. Inside the government compounds, alarms rang across corridors, blinking lights marking impossible trajectories. Soldiers scrambled, radios squawked contradictory orders, and yet every plan seemed preordained to fail. Venezuela's defenses, built to impress on paper, crumbled under the precision of modern tactics. Anti-aircraft batteries swung blindly, tracking blips that disappeared before they could be engaged. Panic spread quietly at first, a creeping fog of disbelief, before exploding into chaos. Officers barked instructions over static, while junior personnel froze, unable to process that the strike was not a drill, not a misfire, but a full-scale, coordinated assault. In the streets, ordinary citizens felt it differently. Dogs barked at the unnatural sounds. Families huddled under tables, walls vibrating with kinetic energy, unsure whether the explosions were over or just beginning. Emergency broadcasts offered fragmented instructions, alternating between reassurance and alert, collapsing credibility in seconds. People texted relatives abroad, their messages half-sent as signals dropped in sequence. Social media timelines filled with rumors, videos, cries for information, while global feeds amplified the tension, each notification a pulse of adrenaline connecting the dispersed world to a single point of terror and uncertainty. High above, drones scanned the horizon, feeding live images into control rooms thousands of miles away. Precision strikes hit key installations with surgical accuracy, while cyber operations disrupted command chains. Venezuela's ability to respond coherently disintegrated. In the capital, ministers and generals huddled in bunkers, watching surveillance screens that betrayed their own city, unable to tell friend from foe. The illusions of control vanished. Every move, every signal, every attempt at coordination was anticipated anticipated, neutralized. Even as confusion reigned, no official confirmation emerged. The media groped for verified sources while the internet hummed with speculation, eyewitness reports, and fragmented footage. People across borders watched in disbelief, struggling to separate rumor from reality. For exile Venezuelans, it felt like history bending in real time. A homeland they remembered from childhood, a country they feared returning to, now reshaped in a single night. For allies and adversaries alike, the implications were immediate and impossible to ignore. And yet, amid the chaos, a whisper began to circulate. Impossible, almost absurd. The unthinkable had begun to take shape. Figures once untouchable were suddenly vulnerable. Command structures that seemed eternal were fractured in hours. Citizens whispered among themselves, stunned, fearful, incredulous. Could this be real? Was the claim true? Was the regime collapsing from within while they were still inside it, trapped, watching, waiting? The night reached its apex, a crescendo of destruction, fear, and disbelief. Every explosion, every pulse of electronic interference, every frantic radio call, all converged into a singular truth. The balance of power had shifted, and no one could yet predict the full extent. The country held its breath. The world held its breath. And then Trump stepped to the microphone. The world waited, the air electric with speculation, as Donald Trump stepped to the podium. Cameras tracked his every movement, lights reflecting in dark lenses, capturing a figure both familiar and unervingly calm. The room itself seemed to shrink around him. No teleprompter could hold the weight of what he was about to say. No scripted statement could contain the shock. He opened his mouth, not with haste, but with measured cadence, each word a deliberate pulse in a symphony of tension. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady, eyes scanning the crowd, absorbing the collective anticipation. "We have taken decisive action tonight." Pause. The statement hung, suspended, allowing the gravity to settle. Journalists leaned forward. Analysts furrowed brows. Social media feeds churned with speculation and fear. This was not a routine briefing. It was a performance of power, calibrated to ensure every listener understood that the rules had shifted. Another pause, a subtle pivot, then he continued. "Nicolás Maduro and his wife have been captured." Each phrase was enunciated like a drumbeat, slow enough for the world to process, fast enough to prevent disbelief from rooting itself. Reporters blinked, anchors froze mid-sentence, and the global media ecosystem sputtered under the weight of the claim. The words themselves became objects of fascination, studied for nuance, tone, and implication. Captured, not cornered, not contained. Captured. The term reverberated legally, morally, symbolically. Captured implied agency. Captured implied accountability. Captured implied a rupture in what had been considered untouchable power. In international law, it signaled extradition or detainment, a suspension of sovereignty and an assertion of force. It was a word that carried centuries of precedent, both victorious and catastrophic, imbued with danger, precedent, and possibility. Symbolically, it shattered the image of invincibility Maduro had cultivated for over a decade, eroding the aura of untouchability around him. For ordinary citizens and exiles alike, it represented vindication, a reversal of decades-long suffering, and a confrontation with the tangible consequences of authoritarianism. As Trump paused again, the room shifted under the tension of expectation. He allowed the silence to stretch, letting cameras pan the journalists, the security staff, the dignitaries, the analysts, all processing, reacting, unable to interject. Then he added with crisp finality, "They have been flown out safely." Safety. The word both reassured and provoked. It suggested precision, control, and inevitability. The act was complete, yet verification remained external, creating a paradox of certainty in delivery and uncertainty in evidence. It forced the world to wrestle with the truth of what they had just heard. Anchors scrambled for context. Experts were pulled onto panels with insufficient information, forced to analyze the unverified, parse the improbable, and predict ramifications from the air of ambiguity. Journalists typed rapidly, hoping to substantiate claims that might rewrite Latin American geopolitics overnight. Social media erupted with screenshots, fragments of live feeds, and quotes dissected word by word. The digital world amplified every pause, every syllable, every reaction, each iteration more sensational than the last. Meanwhile, Trump remained a study in composure, unmoved by the chaos erupting around him. Unflinching in the face of skepticism, he delivered certainty in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. The juxtaposition was stark. While Caracas quivered, world leaders convened emergency calls, markets shifted, and analysts recalculated their risk matrices, Trump exuded control, calm, and authority. His presence alone reframed the narrative, transforming panic into spectacle, uncertainty into deliberate drama. The legal and political weight of the announcement continued to sink in. For Maduro, capture meant removal from power without negotiation, a symbolic decapitation of authority. For the region, it meant intervention without precedent in modern Latin American history, a demonstration of force that blurred the lines between policy, justice, and theater. For the world, it posed uncomfortable questions about sovereignty, intervention, and the ethical calculus of power. How much is too much? When does justice become coercion? Who decides the legitimacy of action when authority itself is contested? Verification was the silent antagonist in the room. No body cam footage had emerged. No independent confirmation could immediately validate the claim. Yet the effect was undeniable. Citizens, exiles, and global observers reacted as though the event had occurred, because in political theater, perception often becomes reality. Governments issued cautious statements. Analysts hedged. Social feeds exploded with disbelief, anticipation, and celebration. Each second of delay intensified tension, magnifying the stakes of proof, while speculation itself shaped behavior, policy, and perception alike. And then, layer upon layer, the media ecosystem began to fracture and multiply the moment. Hashtags trended before official confirmation, memes circulated interpreting the event, and political commentators competed to contextualize what may have just happened. The line between shock, spectacle, and reality blurred. Ordinary citizens across continents watched as history seemed to accelerate, their timelines flooding with videos, commentary, and frantic messages. Families in exile debated hope versus skepticism. The world could not yet confirm, but it could feel the tremor, authority challenged, power displaced, a moment that would be remembered before it could be verified. And just as the tension reached its zenith, just as every feed, every office, every living room, every capital city held its collective breath, the first whispers began to circulate. If true, the implications were instantaneous, irreversible, and global. The unthinkable was no longer hypothetical. A dictator once untouchable now existed as a symbol of vulnerability, a demonstration that power, no matter how absolute, is always contingent. Every political map, every policy assumption, every analyst note shifted, recalibrated, and waited for confirmation that might never come. Within minutes, the internet exploded. The announcement landed like a shockwave, rippling outward faster than anyone could track. Social media ignited instantly. Hashtags climbed to trending status within minutes. Hashtag Maduro captured. Hashtag Venezuela shift. Hashtag breaking from Caracas. While memes, GIFs, and viral threads transformed the moment into a global spectacle. Analysts scrambled to post commentary. Influencers debated ethics. Ordinary users shared videos, screenshots, and unverified clips, each iteration feeding the frenzy. Celebration collided with outrage. Hope collided with fear. And across platforms, the world seemed to vibrate with a single question. Could this really be happening? In Washington, allies and adversaries alike reacted in real time. European capitals issued cautious statements. balancing acknowledgement of Maduro's removal with concern for precedent and legality. Latin American governments struggled to position themselves. Some celebrated the removal of an authoritarian figure. Others condemned what they framed as U.S. overreach. Neighboring countries felt the tremor immediately. Borders, airspace, and trade corridors all braced for uncertainty. Moscow and Beijing, traditional allies of Caracas, issued sharply worded rebukes, warning of destabilization, while U.S. partners in the hemisphere watched carefully, weighing gratitude against apprehension. The world had become a theater of reaction, each state measuring its own interests against the spectacle of American decisiveness. The public response in Latin America was equally fractured. In Caracas, people whispered in alleys and crowded balconies, unsure whether to hope or to hide. For years, Venezuelans had lived under scarcity, repression, and exile. The sudden capture of a dictator seemed at once miraculous and terrifying. Families flooded online forums and social channels with messages of relief and disbelief, while others worried that the vacuum could ignite chaos, retaliation, or humanitarian crisis. Across the region, immigrants in Miami, Madrid, and Bogotá watched with trembling anticipation, connecting their own stories of displacement to the unfolding drama back home. Optimism and dread existed side by side, inseparable, impossible to reconcile fully, yet impossible to ignore. Commentators split sharply. Some praised the operation as bold leadership, a decisive move that removed a tyrant without prolonged conflict, proving that action could replace endless negotiation. Others condemned it as reckless escalation, a dangerous precedent for sovereignty, international law, and regional stability. Panels on cable news became battlegrounds of rhetoric, each expert parsing military strategy, legal implications, and political optics with feverish intensity. Analysts compared it to historical interventions, drawing lines to coups, sanctions, and peacekeeping failures. Every opinion was amplified, dissected, and challenged, feeding into the same global feedback loop that had propelled Trump's announcement into virality. Culturally, the moment resonated far beyond politics. Artists, musicians, and writers referenced it immediately, capturing collective disbelief in images, lyrics, and threads. Psychologically, the effect was profound. The capture of a dictator symbolized the vulnerability of those once untouchable, validating long-held frustrations and hopes for justice. Communities of exiles and immigrants felt a rare, shared sense of agency, as if the narrative of their homeland had shifted in real time. Conversations turned to memory, identity, and morality, connecting generations who had witnessed repression and migration to a sudden, uncharted present. The event became both story and signal, a cultural marker that would linger long after verification, debate, and political maneuvering settled into history books. The internet became a mirror of humanity's collective awe and anxiety. Tweets speculated about timelines. Live streams analyzed satellite images. Memes offered levity amid uncertainty. Ordinary citizens became journalists, fact-checkers, and commentators simultaneously. The global attention magnified every word, every image, and every fragment of reporting, creating a feedback loop of validation and amplification. The psychological impact was immediate. The impossible had happened, and yet no one could fully grasp the consequences. Conversations spanned coffee shops, classrooms, offices, and family dinners, linking personal histories to international spectacle. Fear and hope intertwined, shaping perception and reaction before facts could settle. In boardrooms and parliaments, leaders debated contingency plans. In households and community centers, families weighed what it meant for their lives and futures. For decades, the Latin American region had felt the weight of dictatorships, sanctions, and foreign interference. Now, history seemed to accelerate in ways few had imagined. Public consciousness, social media, and traditional media intertwined, producing a collective experience that was immediate, intense, and irrevocable. And yet, amid the tweets, the trending hashtags, the commentary, and the celebration, one question loomed larger than all others. It was not about who had acted or how or why. It was about what followed. The world had reacted. The news had spread. The spectacle had consumed attention. But the real question wasn't what just happened. It was what comes next. In the aftermath of shock and spectacle, the story demanded perspective. History does not pause for announcements. It absorbs them, judges them, and places them in context. The capture of Nicolás Maduro and his wife was more than a headline. It was a seismic punctuation in a long narrative of power, resistance, and consequence. Across centuries and continents, humanity has witnessed rulers who believe themselves invincible, only to discover that authority is contingent on more than loyalty, fear, or wealth. From monarchs deposed in revolutions to dictators overthrown by movements they thought contained, the lesson remains consistent. No leader is untouchable. Even the most fortified, the most insulated, the most confident in their absolute control can fall when forces align against them. The significance of this moment resonates not only in political terms but in human ones. Power carries a cost, one that is rarely borne solely by the powerful. It weighs on families, on communities, on societies. Maduro's decades of control were marked by the suffering of millions, a stark reminder that authority, divorced from accountability, can inflict consequences that ripple across generations. When leaders wield influence unchecked, dignity is eroded, institutions corrode, and the ordinary lives of citizens become collateral. This capture forces reflection. That governance is a responsibility, and its failure exacts a human toll. Yet the moment is not merely a judgment on Maduro. It is a message to the world. Authoritarian regimes, long confident in isolation and control, were suddenly reminded of a fundamental truth. Visibility matters, oversight matters, and accountability matters. In the age of global communication, with eyes watching from capitals and living rooms alike, no tyranny is shielded from scrutiny. The capture serves as a warning shot, not just in a military sense, but morally and symbolically. It demonstrates that the world, collectively, can insist on justice and confront impunity, even when it seems inconvenient or improbable. For immigrants, for exiles, for those whose families have known repression and displacement, the event reverberates on a deeply personal level. It validates stories of endurance and hope, showing that resilience can intersect with accountability. The suffering endured by communities under authoritarian regimes is acknowledged not through words alone, but through action that challenges the permanence of abuse. In that sense, the moment becomes both a reckoning and an affirmation that justice, however delayed, can arrive, and that agency exists even against overwhelming odds. At the same time, the event reframes the conversation around sovereignty and ethics. Intervention, when conducted under the scrutiny of law and global attention, carries weight and consequence. It demands reflection on the balance between action and restraint, between moral urgency and human cost. It challenges citizens, policymakers, and observers to consider the intersection of justice and power, and to recognize that choices have consequences far beyond immediate headlines. Every decision to act, or to refrain, echoes across borders, shaping the lives of millions, testing values, and demanding engagement. The inspirational resonance of this moment lies not in celebration of force, but in affirmation of dignity and agency. It reminds us that standing against oppression, even indirectly, matters, that the vulnerable are never truly invisible, that courage and decisiveness can intersect with justice to produce outcomes that reaffirm moral and civic principles. For communities that have long felt sidelined, marginalized, or unheard, the lesson is clear. Change is possible, authority is accountable, and history is not predetermined. As the dust settles on headlines, hashtags, and analysis, the true value of this event emerges in reflection. It becomes a story about the power of action grounded in principle, the fragility of unchecked authority, and the enduring importance of human dignity. It affirms that societies, collectively, can insist on accountability and shape the arc of justice. It uplifts the notion that even when systems seem immutable, courage and conviction intersect with opportunity to alter history. And as citizens, exiles, and observers take stock, the inspiration crystallizes. This is not simply a military maneuver or a political headline. It is a reminder that justice is not abstract, that power carries cost, and that every individual, regardless of origin, status, or circumstance, contributes to the currents that shape freedom, accountability, and dignity across nations and generations. The world may be unpredictable, the moment chaotic, and the consequences vast, but the message endures. Authority is conditional, accountability is inevitable, and courage can change the arc of history. At 3:17 a.m., Venezuela went dark, and the world watched stunned as headlines claimed the impossible. Nicolás Maduro and his wife captured and flown out. From the initial shock to the endless analysis, the moment has left a mark that will ripple across borders, generations, and consciousness. What began as a single sentence has transformed into questions about power, justice, and the responsibilities that come with both. The magnitude of the claim cannot be overstated. For decades, Venezuela endured scarcity, repression, and exile. A regime that seemed untouchable, invulnerable, and insulated from accountability now faces a reality that redefines authority itself. The implications are global, a precedent for intervention, a warning to authoritarian rulers, and a test of moral judgment for every nation observing the balance between justice and chaos. This is a moment that history will record, long before every fact is verified, long before the dust settles. But the moment also asks a deeper question. Is this strength, decisive and bold, the triumph of justice over tyranny, or the start of something far more dangerous, where power moves without restraint and consequences are borne across borders? The answer is not simple, and it is not fixed. It lives in the reflection of every citizen, immigrant, and observer who weighs hope against fear, courage against risk, and action against morality. What will we demand of our leaders? What will we expect of ourselves? These questions linger because this moment is bigger than one headline, one strike, or one administration. Now, the responsibility passes to us as a global audience. Stay informed. Share what you learn. Join the discussion with integrity, empathy, and awareness of the human lives behind the headlines. Subscribe to keep watching history unfold, not as passive observers, but as engaged participants in a world where accountability matters, justice is cost, and every voice contributes to the conversation about power, dignity, and consequence. Because moments like these are fleeting, but their echoes last. And as we process what happened tonight, one truth remains unavoidable. Even the most untouchable rulers are mortal. Every action has consequence, and the shadows of history are never as quiet as they seem.